So we are looking at texture this week. And texture, again, is one of the elements of art. This one is a little bit less involved than some of the other ones, such as color and stuff like that. But texture is the way that something feels or looks like it could feel in art. So the way something feels or looks like it could feel. Examples of this. So you can see on the left and on the right, you can see that texture that was created by the sculptor adding those spikes. On the right, sometimes you have to show texture in 2D, right? So this artist uses different elements of art, such as line and shape, to create that texture. So there's two different types of texture that we look at. So that's why I was saying it's a little bit more straightforward because there's really only two things you have to remember with texture. And that is the two types, okay? So there's real tactile texture. So that is something that you could touch. You can imagine if you were in person with this, what it would feel like. And then there's visual or implied texture, okay? So that's when artists are generally working two-dimensionally, like in drawing, and they're creating texture by using different types of lines and values and shapes. So to create real texture, artists use materials that have texture, or they can apply materials to the surface of their work. So here's an example of Van Gogh. He's painting in two dimensions, right? But he's adding a ton of paint on there. It's called impasto. When you have a bunch of paint layered on the paint or on the canvas, it creates actual texture, okay? Collage is another way that artists can create texture in their artwork using elements that have texture. Different sculpting techniques and metal techniques to create something that's really popping off of the surface. And then implied texture, they rely on different elements to create their texture. So you can see this illusion of hair here, and it's very well done. So you can almost imagine when you're just looking at this that you could touch that texture of the hair. Again, in this, it's kind of like this slimy texture. So that has a very different feeling to it than if it was just a nice smooth line, right? But you can kind of see what they're going for here. You can imagine what that texture would feel like. Use your imagination a little bit. So here is not actually a photograph, but a painting. So this is Chuck Close. He does these what are called photorealistic paintings. But if you look closely, you can see all of this implied texture. So it's a very flat painting. And if you were to go up and see this in real life and touch it, which you wouldn't want to do because you'd get yelled at by the museum people, but if you touched it, it would be smooth like the canvas, right? But when you look closely, he is trying to create all this implied texture of the stubble and of the skin, and that is implied. So pretty straightforward when it comes to texture. You're just thinking about real texture, which is something that you could actually touch. And when you touched it, it would be popping off the surface, or implied just using line work to create the feeling of texture in your artwork.